I felt the dirt hitting my chest before I could even open my eyes. It was heavy, suffocating, every thud against my ribs a reminder that the woman I once trusted more than anyone now wanted me gone. My wife buried me alive with her own hands, and as the earth swallowed me whole, I realized one truth that would keep me breathing. I wasn't going to die here. I would crawl back out, and when I did, she'd wish the grave had kept me. I used to believe marriage was built on trust. That's what my father told me when I stood at the altar 22 years ago, holding her hands, looking into her eyes that shimmered with tears. We promised forever, but forever, I would learn, doesn't mean anything when love rots into greed, when tenderness curdles into betrayal. It didn't happen overnight. That's the thing people never understand about betrayal. It grows slow, like mold creeping behind wallpaper. At first it's invisible. Then one day the stench fills the house and you realize it's been there all along. She changed after her mother passed. That's what I told myself at first. She was colder, sharper, quicker to anger. Nights once filled with soft laughter and late coffee turned into silence across the dinner table. I'd ask how her day went, and she'd give me one-word answers, her eyes never leaving her phone. Her smiles, once effortless, felt rehearsed, like she was performing a role she no longer enjoyed. I brushed it off. We were middle-aged. Love fades, I thought. Maybe this was just what happens after decades together. But the truth? The truth was far darker. The first real crack came when I found her outside in the backyard at 2 a.m., whispering on the phone. She didn't hear me come down the stairs. I watched from the sliding door, her voice low, urgent, her tone nothing like the woman I married. She laughed softly, different from the brittle chuckle she gave me. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. A man knows when his wife is giving away pieces of herself that no longer belong to him. The next morning, she was all sunshine. Pancakes on the table, coffee brewed just the way I liked it. She kissed me on the cheek, said she loved me. That's when I knew something was wrong. When kindness feels like a mask, it chills you more than cruelty ever could. It went on for weeks. Phone calls she wouldn't explain. Late nights out, money disappearing from our joint account. Still, I clung to denial. I worked long hours, came home exhausted, told myself I was imagining things. I didn't want to believe she was capable of hurting me. Then came the night of the shovel. We argued that evening. About bills, about the house, about nothing really. But her eyes flashed with a hatred I'd never seen. Not annoyance, not frustration, hatred. She said words she couldn't take back, words that felt like knives. You're dead weight. You've always been. She stormed off, slamming the door, leaving me alone with a silence that rang in my ears. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. Something in her voice rattled me. Around midnight, I woke to a creak. I opened my eyes just enough to see her standing in the doorway, staring at me. No phone, no book, just staring. I closed my eyes again, feigning sleep, my heart thudding in my chest. Eventually, she turned and walked away. I lay there until the sun rose, my skin clammy, my gut tight with dread. The next day, she suggested a drive. Out to the country, she said. Fresh air will do us good. Her smile was soft, reassuring, the way it used to be. Against my better judgment, I agreed. That's what love does. Even after years of corrosion, it blinds you. We drove out past the edge of town, into fields where the world stretched wide and empty. She hummed along to the radio, tapping her fingers on the steering wheel, looking for all the world like the girl I once knew. When we stopped, she said she wanted to take a walk. I followed her through a patch of trees, leaves crunching under our feet. Then I saw it. The shovel leaned against a tree trunk. Freshly turned earth nearby, dark and damp. My chest tightened. My instincts screamed, but before I could move, I felt the blow to the back of my head. The world spun. I fell to my knees, the taste of blood sharp in my mouth. Through blurred vision, I saw her standing over me, shovel in hand, her face expressionless. No anger, no remorse, just cold determination. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though her voice was steady. "It's easier this way." I tried to speak, but dirt filled my mouth before I could form words. She pushed me into the hole, shovelful after shovelful raining down, muffling my gasps, stealing the air from my lungs. The weight pressed heavier and heavier, and soon the world was nothing but darkness and earth and the thunder of my heartbeat in my ears. But death didn't come. Somewhere deep inside, survival clawed back. I don't know if it was rage, if it was instinct, or if it was the simple refusal to let her win. But as the soil pressed against my chest, as consciousness flickered in and out, I told myself one thing: I will not die here. And when I crawled out of that grave, choking on dirt and blood, clawing at the night air, I knew what had to be done. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was war. When I finally clawed my way free, the night air burned my lungs like fire. My fingernails were torn, bleeding, packed with soil. My arms shook with exhaustion, but I forced them to keep pulling, dragging myself out of the hole my wife had chosen as my grave. The world spun, stars wheeling above me, mocking me with their brightness. I collapsed on the cold earth, half dead but alive. And alive was enough. I don't remember how long I lay there, staring at the sky, gasping like a drowning man who'd broken the surface. My mind flickered between rage and disbelief. She had looked me in the eye, whispered an apology, and then buried me. No hesitation, no second thought. The woman I had shared my bed with for 22 years had decided my life was worth less than the dirt covering me. It took everything I had to stagger to my feet. My legs trembled, and every step sent knives of pain through my skull where the shovel had struck. I stumbled through the trees, guided only by instinct. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost its meaning. When I finally reached the roadside, my clothes torn and filthy, I must have looked like a ghost crawling out of hell. A truck passed without stopping. Then another. Who would stop for a bloodied man stumbling out of the woods at dawn? Eventually, I found myself at the edge of town. I didn't go home. That would have been the first place she'd check. No, I went to the one place I knew she'd never expect. The old hunting cabin my father left me, hidden miles away in the back country. The cabin smelled of dust and memory. I collapsed onto the cot, the boards creaking beneath me, and for the first time since the shovel struck my head, I let myself break. My body shook with sobs I couldn't control. It wasn't just the pain, it was the betrayal. The sheer weight of it crushed me more than the dirt ever could. But grief hardened into something sharper: rage. As the days passed, I tended to my wounds. Cleaned them with whiskey, wrapped them with strips of cloth. My body mended slowly, but my mind never stopped working. She thought I was dead. That much was clear. She'd buried me herself. She hadn't checked for a pulse, hadn't seen me climb free. In her mind, I was gone. That was my advantage. From the safety of the cabin, I planned. I knew rushing back would be suicide. She'd play the grieving widow, maybe even cash an insurance or sell off the house. She'd have her story ready. I couldn't just appear and accuse her. People would call me crazy, or worse, she'd twist the story until I was the villain. No. If I wanted justice, if I wanted revenge, I needed proof. And I needed her to feel the same fear I had felt under the dirt. On the 7th night, I left the cabin under cover of darkness and made my way back to town. My body was still weak, but my resolve was stronger than ever. I crept through the streets like a shadow, careful to avoid being seen. When I reached my neighborhood, my chest clenched at the sight of my own house glowing warm in the night. Through the window, I saw her. She was laughing, a wine glass in her hand, the television flickering light across her face. Not a trace of grief, not a sign of loss. It was as if I had never existed. And then I saw him, a man I recognized, though it had been years. An old friend, one of mine. He sat beside her, too close, their shoulders brushing. They clinked glasses, their laughter mingling, sickening me to my core. My stomach turned as realization sank in. This wasn't just murder for money or freedom. She wanted me gone so she could replace me. The rage that rose in me was primal. I pressed myself against the tree line, forcing myself to stay hidden. Not yet, I told myself. Not yet. I began to watch her. Every night from the shadows, I studied their routines. They drank together. He left around midnight, slinking out like a thief. She'd lock the door behind him and head upstairs alone. I wrote it all down in a notebook I carried, my evidence growing page by page. One night, I followed him. He drove to his house across town, a small place with a sagging porch. Through the curtains, I saw him pacing, phone to his ear, grinning like a fool. I couldn't hear the words, but I knew who he was talking to. My wife. My betrayer. The more I watched, the more the truth came into focus. This wasn't a sudden betrayal. It had been planned, carefully, meticulously. My death wasn't an accident of rage. It was a decision made long before the shovel struck. That knowledge didn't break me. It steeled me. I began to prepare. At the cabin, I stockpiled supplies. Food, water, rope, tools. I kept track of their meetings, memorized their habits. I even tailed her during the day, careful to stay out of sight. She went about her life as though nothing had happened. Shopping, laughing with neighbors, waving to people who believed she was a grieving wife. Her performance was flawless, but cracks began to show. Sometimes she'd pause in the middle of a task, glancing over her shoulder as if she felt eyes on her. Sometimes she'd lock the doors twice before bed. Once I saw her staring into the dark yard for nearly an hour, her wine untouched. Maybe it was guilt. Or maybe it was something else. Maybe she felt me. That gave me an idea. It wasn't enough to gather proof. It wasn't enough to strike back suddenly. No, I wanted her to suffer the way I had. I wanted her to feel buried alive in her own mind. So I started leaving signs. Small, subtle things only she would notice. A photograph of us slipped under her windshield wiper. A muddy handprint on the back door. A trail of dirt leading to the bedroom window. Always just enough to unnerve, never enough to prove. I watched the fear grow in her eyes. She stopped laughing so easily. She drank more. She argued with her lover. I could see the tension eating away at her, and it fed me like a starving man at a feast. Each night I stood outside, watching, waiting. She had buried me once, but now it was her turn. Her turn to know what it meant to choke on dread, to wonder if the shadows were reaching for her. Her time was coming, and when it did, she would wish she had left me in that grave. The first time I heard her scream, it was almost enough. I had left nothing but a cracked photograph of us on the kitchen counter, the glass splintered like our vows. I watched from the tree line as she walked in, wine bottle in hand, humming. She froze the second her eyes caught it. Her body went rigid, the color draining from her face. The scream tore out of her like an animal cornered. She dropped the bottle, glass shattering across the tile, and stumbled back, clutching the counter for support. It was music. That scream fed me more than food or water ever could. For days I'd lived on rage, on the memory of dirt pressing against my chest. But now I had her fear, raw and real, and it was intoxicating. Her lover came running in from the living room, his voice sharp with panic. "What happened?" She pointed at the photo, trembling. He picked it up, scoffed, and said something about kids playing tricks. But I saw the flicker in his eyes, the doubt, the unease. He didn't believe it was random any more than she did. I didn't need to see their argument to know it was coming. I slipped away into the dark, my heart pounding with satisfaction. One seed planted, many more to come. I made it my mission to unravel her mind thread by thread. Each night I left a different reminder. The muddy handprint had been my favorite, pressed against the bathroom mirror where only she would see it. Another night I moved her wedding ring from the jewelry box to her nightstand. Just once I left the back door unlocked after slipping in and out, knowing she'd find it in the morning. Sleep began to vanish from her eyes. She carried herself like a woman hunted, jumping at shadows, snapping at her lover, drinking more with every passing day. She told him someone was watching. I knew because I watched them fight, her hands flailing, his voice rising. He didn't want to believe her. He wanted to believe she was losing her mind. Perfect. Let him. The stronger her paranoia grew, the weaker their bond became. And that was when I started thinking bigger. Because torment was sweet, yes, but torment wasn't justice. Justice required exposure. Justice required her undoing in the eyes of everyone she'd deceived. I needed proof. And proof, I realized, was closer than I thought. One evening, I followed her lover to a bar on the edge of town. He sat with friends, laughing too loud, his hand wrapped around a whiskey glass. He was careless, sloppy. When he went outside for a smoke, I slipped into the shadows near his car. Inside, in the glove box, I found it. A burner phone. No password, no lock. I didn't steal it, I didn't need to. I just copied the SIM. Hours later at the cabin, I scrolled through the messages, and there it was. Her words, plans, jokes about me. Soon it'll all be ours. He has no idea. Dead weight. Every word cut deeper than the last, but I welcomed the pain. It was proof. Concrete, undeniable proof. But I didn't rush. Revenge isn't served hot. It's savored cold. I wanted her to collapse under the weight of her own fear before I struck. So I tightened the screws. I broke into the house one night when I knew she'd be gone. I moved things around, just slightly. Enough for her to notice. Her slippers in the wrong place. A chair angled differently. A single fork missing from the drawer. To anyone else, nothing. To her, a silent message. I'm here. She stopped smiling in public. Neighbors whispered about how grief was eating her alive, how she looked haunted. If only they knew the truth. One night I stood at the window and watched her cry on the couch, clutching that man's shirt like a lifeline. Her lover tried to calm her, but she pushed him away, shouting that she knew I was still out there. He grabbed her shoulders, told her I was dead, that she had buried me herself. My pulse quickened at those words. She had admitted it, even if only to him. I wondered how it felt in her chest when she said it out loud. The time for games was drawing to a close. I felt it in my bones, the way I had felt the soil pressing down on me, the way I had felt my lungs collapse and fight for air. She was cracking, and soon she'd break. So I planned the finale. It would happen on the anniversary of our wedding, 23 years to the day. Poetic, wasn't it? A vow made in front of God, broken in the dirt, avenged on the date it all began. I watched her that day, through the crack in the curtains. She dressed carefully, poured herself glass after glass of wine, paced the living room with trembling hands. Her lover was there, trying to comfort her, but he looked weary, beaten down by weeks of her paranoia. When night fell, I made my move. I crept into the backyard, the same yard where she had whispered on the phone months ago. The house glowed warm, but inside there was no warmth at all. I could hear their voices through the thin walls. She was crying again. He was shouting. The sound of a glass shattering followed, and then silence. I slipped in through the back door, quiet as breath. The house smelled of spilled wine and fear. My shadow stretched across the wall as I stepped into the living room. They both turned at once. Her face went pale. Her glass dropped from her hand, crimson liquid bleeding into the carpet. For a long moment no one spoke. She just stared at me, lips trembling, her body shaking like a leaf caught in a storm. He, on the other hand, stepped forward, fists clenched. "You're supposed to be dead," he spat, voice cracking. I smiled, slow and cold. I was. She made a sound I'll never forget, a broken gasp, part sob, part scream. She staggered back, pressing against the wall, her eyes wide with horror. Every ounce of fear I had planted in her bloomed at once, and I drank it in. But this wasn't the end. Not yet. The end would come when the world saw her for what she was, when her lies crumbled in the daylight and her name became poison. I wasn't just going to take her life. I was going to take everything she thought she had won, and as I stood there watching her shake, her lover pale and trembling beside her, I knew the moment of reckoning had arrived. The moment we'd all been rushing toward, the collapse, the reckoning, the moment when paper and doubt would do what shovels could not, came not with a roar, but with a quiet knock. I had spent weeks arranging that single knock, making it a small hammer that would strike at the foundation of her lies. I had whispered evidence into the right hands, left documents in the paths of people who still cared about truth, and fed pieces of the ledger to those who knew how to make a rumor look like a reason. I wanted the world outside our rotten house to act as the jury I had no interest in sitting on alone. On a brittle autumn morning, 2 men in suits walked up the path. Their steps were deliberate, businesslike. The neighbor who'd delivered my envelope waited on the sidewalk, palms clasped at his chest like an anxious amateur. I stood on the back porch, watching from the shadows as Eliza opened the door in her robe, hair wild, mascara streaked like the map of a life collapsing. The look that passed between her and the men was the look of a person discovering the language of consequence for the first time. They explained, in the calm, patient voice of bureaucrats, about audits and investigations and legal hold notices. They did not shout. There was no dramatic placing of cuffs. That kind of theater belongs in movies. Real ruin proceeds with paperwork. It arrives in certified letters and polite interviews, in people you once called friends avoiding your calls because they don't want to be liable for the social stain. She tried to explain at first. Perfume of denial clung to her words as she named explanations that would have worked months earlier. "It's an error," she said. "There must be a mistake." Her lover, until then the actor in a coward's mask, stood behind her, mouth thin, the bravado drained. For a moment he met my eyes, and in that brief glance I saw everything I already knew. Panic, calculation, the knowledge that their play had been exposed. When they left, the paper in their hands was a slow-working poison, no less lethal because it was administrative. Invitations dried up. People who'd once complimented her on neighborhood walks were suddenly busy. A contribution she'd expected to rally funds for her charity was quietly deferred. My wife, who had once navigated the town as though everyone owed her a smile, now found herself facing polite distance and the kind of curious pity reserved for people in the first act of a tragedy. It was delicious to watch and terrible to feel at the same time, the two feelings braided together like rope. I didn't set out to watch her burn in public, not out of spite but out of a particular hunger for fairness. She had tried to bury me because she wanted the freedom to remake her world. Now I wanted her to understand what freedom felt like when everything that propped it up was quietly removed. I wanted every brunch invitation that once seemed like worship to become a question mark. I wanted her to hear the small footsteps of acquaintances withdrawing. That was my sentence for her, isolation by degrees, the social death that mirrors the suffocation she tried to inflict on me. But the ledger was not the only blade. There were things I could not leave to whispers. There were faces I needed to confront, and there were truths that required names spoken in rooms where they could not be bent. So I walked into the one place I had always feared most, the cottage of her lover, the man who had laughed and planned and loaded his words with a casual brutality. He answered the door as if he expected visitors. Arrogance is an easy armor to wear until someone takes it off for you. "Do you know what it feels like?" I asked. "Stepping inside without invitation, to learn a woman you slept with put a shovel to her husband's skull?" I didn't wait for an answer. I laid the photographs on his coffee table, the greasy, grainy proofs of their meetings, the scooped receipts, the transfers. I watched his face lose color as the proof landed on the table like a verdict. He reached for the phone, for a call, to make threats, to call lawyers or friends, to invent alibis. I watched his hands tremble. I remember thinking how small he looked, how much less polished when the theater of bravado peeled away. He offered explanations that sounded like the flailing of a drowning man. He spoke of escape, of debt, of promises he'd been fed and believed. None of it mattered. I had what mattered, evidence that tied motive to action. I left him with a choice. There is a path that leads to a quiet night of self-preservation by cooperating, and there is the path of stubborn denial that ends badly in courtrooms. He chose the former because selfishness is a quicker route to survival than illusions. He gave me what I needed: statements, confessions, names. He helped assemble the remainder of the chain connecting desire and shovel. Once the legal gears began to move, it was funny how human habits snapped back into place. People who had written letters of condolence now offered statements, odd little confessions of concern that had, until then, been whispers. The lover's testimony was a key. The ledger was the lock. Together they sealed the case more tightly than any melodramatic scene ever could. She imploded. Not dramatically, not in an explosive scene that the tabloids could sell, but in the slow burn of eroding certainty. The way she looked at me changed first, not with hatred, for hatred requires pride and energy, but with the small, quiet things that happen when someone finally sees the shape of their own ruin. She stopped dressing well. The practiced grace drained. The laugh that once snapped like a brittle candy now wilted. She went to bed earlier and earlier, despite insomnia that sat at the foot of the bed like a sullen child. The nights when the house had been full of whispers and secret meetings now echoed with her solitary pacing. I would lie awake and listen, sometimes because of a dark curiosity, sometimes because I wanted to see the degree to which consequences could teach remorse. What I heard was not always regret. Often it was bargaining, a string of soft apologies addressed to nobody in particular, to the air she had poisoned, to the life she had miscounted as disposable. She'd whisper, "It's not what I meant," as though intention could replay an act already executed. But the ledger doesn't care for intent. Documents do not accept pleas. Paper is indifferent and final. When the day came for them both to be faced with the results of what they had done, I did not attend. I refused to let the choreography of courtrooms become a stage for their desperation. I stayed home and watched from my window as a rally of cars and people moved around our block. Officials, a few journalists, reporters sniffing for sensation. Later the newspapers would file their thin-eyed takes. Later still the neighborhood would discuss and then forget. My satisfaction did not come from a public spectacle. It came from the quiet knowledge that truth had a way of finding purchase in the most ordinary places. Banks, letters, and municipal logs. He was restrained from town for a time. She, for a season, lived in the shadow of explanation, answering questions that routinely tore at the fabric of a private life. There were hearings, interviews, a string of small and precise consequences that compounded like interest. They lost the house in part because equity vanishes quickly when reputations do. Her friends with bank accounts withdrew offers of bailouts. The man who sat in court could no longer offer the alibi of charm. When you remove the scaffolding of practical support, money, favors, social capital, people discover how fragile a life built on the theft of another can be. Once the immediate storm passed, the quieter part of justice took hold. There is an exhaustion that comes after a conflict like this, not unlike the way oceans calm after a storm. For me, that exhaustion was complicated. I had survived. I had outlived the dirt and the blow and the betrayal. But survival reshapes you. You carry the memory of being under the earth like a scar you cannot see but feel each night. I learned to live with it, to put the knowledge to use, to measure people's words with a new calibration, to treat kindness with a careful eye, to accept that second chances are not freely given. In the months after, as life rebuilt itself in the small, careful ways that time allows, something strange happened. People reached out to me. Not the ones who fled, but those who had been quietly watching. Old friends whose calls had been hesitant now stopped by with casseroles and hands that wanted to help. There were mailings from the bank and checklists from lawyers, and an odd assortment of bureaucratic kindnesses. I appreciated practical things: help with taxes, a neighbor fixing the sag in my fence, someone mowing the lawn when I had a doctor's appointment. These small acts, practical and human, healed in a way the dramatic closure could not. And Eliza? She left town quietly, after a period of business closures, selling whatever she could under the strain of the audit and the social attrition. She didn't scream, didn't fight in the papers for sympathy. Perhaps that would have been more satisfying, to watch a grand performance of denial. But there is a somber dignity to the slow retreat of a person forced to carry a heavy, inescapable truth. She moved away with little more than a suitcase and the weight of knowing what she had done. I heard later that she found work in another place, a long commute from the town where she'd once been accepted and trusted. The man she'd chosen as a partner in betrayal kept his distance, as if the world's shame had turned even his bravado into a liability. Sometimes when the house was quiet and I sat at the table that once hosted their laughter, I would look at the spot in the garden where the shovel had stood. The soil there had been turned up and replaced so many times that it now held a different memory. Not the scene of a crime, but a patch of earth that knew how to be tended. I planted something that spring, a small tree, stubborn and green. People called it strange. Some said it was a curse, others a symbol. I didn't tell them what it was to me. It was simply a testament that life can be coaxed back from the darkest of places, if you're patient enough, and if you have the stubbornness to keep digging. There are nights I still wake from the wrong kind of dreams, the ones where the shovel is heavy in the dark and the dirt presses close. The heart remembers what the head tries to bury. But those nights are fewer, and the mornings come sooner these days, with pale light and the sound of birds that do not care for human tragedies. I walk through town. I buy a paper and read the comics. I smell the bakery on Main Street and think of things that are small and good. The quiet life doesn't erase what happened, but it teaches you new habits. How to make a cup of coffee and savor it fully. How to answer a neighbor who asks about the weather without collapsing back into old ghosts. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty. They ask if revenge softened me or hardened me in ways they would find horrifying. I tell them truthfully that I feel a complicated mixture. I feel sorrow for the person she might once have been. I feel righteous anger for the life she tried to take. I feel a cautious pride that I did not let myself be erased. There is no easy moral belt to tighten around actions like mine. There is only survival and then the long, deliberate work of being a man who keeps his hands clean enough to sleep. If someone asks me if I'd do it again, if I would choose the road I chose, the answer is simple and cold. I would choose survival. I would choose breathing over silence. I would choose to be here, stumbling though I may be, rather than a story told in the polite privacy of other people's dinner conversations. That, for me, is the final line in the ledger. Not revenge for revenge's sake, but the right to exist freely without the threat of being buried. She wanted me dead. She acted on it. She planted me under the earth she trusted me to till. But she underestimated what lived in me, a will so stubborn it clawed through soil and newsprint and the soft lies people tell themselves to sleep at night. When I crawled out, I did not come back as the same man who had been shoved into that grave. I returned forged on the other side, with a practiced weariness and a quieter sense of justice. People remember the headlines, but in the end what matters is what you do with the day after the news fades. I made my life about small mercies then, repairing the fence, fixing the leaky roof, learning how to sleep without the weight of the past crushing me. The town moved on. She moved on. I stayed, I lived, and that, I know now, was the truest kind of victory, to remain steady, to watch the seasons turn, and to know that the man who had been buried had not only returned, but had also learned what it means to live deliberately, to protect the fragile thing that is trust, and to never again allow myself to be so lightly counted out.